Okay, good morning, everyone, and I hope we are fine and well. You're highly welcome to this IMF 2004 Regional Economic Outlook. We have so many people here. I'm not sure where to start recognizing. We have our Vice Chancellor, Professor Nelson Kenedo. We have our Oga. Please clap very well now. It's not easy. We also have Mr. Bismarck Rewane, CEO, Financial Derivatives. We have Mr. Aten Laws, economist, IMF. We have Mr. Dr. Olusegun Omisakin, Chief Economist, Nigerian Economic Summit Group. We have Mr. Sule Samuel, CEO of Renaissance Capital. We have Catherine Patillo, Deputy Director, IMF African Department. And many other people. We also have our Dean, ably represented by Dr. Uche Attoh in our midst. You're highly welcome. So let me, as they say normally, let me stand on the existing protocol if there's anyone existing. But you're all welcome. So for us to start, let me invite the Dean of Lagos Business School, Professor Chris Ogbeche, ably represented by Dr. Uche Attoh, to give us a welcome address. Dr. Attoh, please. Thank you.
The Vice Chancellor, our invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Let me begin by apologizing for the absence of the Dean, Professor Chris Ogbeche, who is unavoidably absent on official reasons, and he has asked me to come and do my best in welcoming you. And I read this address on his behalf. It is a pleasure to welcome each of you to today's learning session organized by the International Monetary Fund in partnership with Lagos Business School and Nigerian Economic Summit Group. This gathering reflects our commitment to engaging with global insights on critical economic issues, particularly those affecting Sub-Saharan Africa. The theme of today's session, IMF Autumn 2024 Regional Economic Outlook, Sub-Saharan Africa, is both timely and significant. This session will provide valuable insights into the current economic landscape in our region, addressing challenges and uncovering opportunities for sustainable growth and development. Such knowledge aligns seamlessly with our mission at Lagos Business School to cultivate leaders equipped to drive meaningful economic progress in Nigeria and throughout the continent. As we commence, I encourage you all to listen attentively, learn openly, and engage actively with our speakers. Today's sessions offers a unique opportunity to deepen our understanding of the forces shaping our region and to draw inspiration from expertise and perspectives shared. A special thanks will go to our distinguished speakers, our partners at IMF, and all those who have contributed to making this event possible. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to what promises to be an enlightening and impactful session. Thank you, signed by Professor Chris Uweche. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ato. But one of the most interesting things that I heard was when he said that it was signed by the Dean, Professor Uweche, which means that he should not be held responsible for anything in that speech, that it was by the Dean. So thank you very, very much. And we're all eager to hear from IMF. When I told some people that they are coming today, some people we are very optimistic. Maybe they are going to tell us that inflation will come down next year, interest rates will be single digit, unemployment will go down, and Nigeria will be one of the fattest, Africa will be the fastest region, and Nigeria the fastest country in Africa. So we are looking forward to the presentation. So let me invite the Atenlos, to economists, IMF, to come and give us the regional economic outlook. Atenlos, please. Thank you.
Apologies, give me a second. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us today. Today I will present the IMF's Regional Economic Outlook on Sub-Saharan Africa, titled Reforms Amid Great Expectations. Many countries in the region have undertaken significant reforms to reduce macroeconomic imbalances, and these are bearing fruit. However, challenges persist as policymakers face a difficult balancing act while they strive to continue to reduce macroeconomic balances while simultaneously facing elevated spending pressures for development needs and social and political constraints. For background, our RIO is published twice a year in April and October. It contains a main report which covers conjunctural developments, the outlook, policy advice, and data tools. And alongside the main report, we have 3 analytical notes on topical issues each time. So for this round, we have 1 note on job creation, 1 on growth divergence, and 1 on gender equality. So turning to the main report, I'll begin with an overview of recent developments in the outlook before I look at risks, and then at the end, some policy advice and a brief outline of the 3 notes that we cover. Our report begins with 3 pieces of good news. The first piece of good news: overall, internal and external macroeconomic imbalances have started to decline, mainly based on policy adjustments. Significant fiscal consolidation occurred, which has stabilised the median public debt to GDP ratio, albeit at a high level of 58%. As the left-hand chart shows, though, with the interquartile range, there is quite a range for countries in the region. More than 2/3 of countries have undertaken fiscal consolidation, with the median primary balance expected to narrow by 0.7 percentage points alone in 2024. And these have included notable improvements in Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Zambia, among others. And further fiscal consolidation is projected in the year ahead. Also on the imbalances side, median inflation has declined in many countries. Policymakers tightened policy rates under very difficult circumstances, and as a result, inflation is declining in around about half the countries in the region, as shown in the left-hand chart. And it's already within or below target band in about half of countries. Despite this progress, inflation is still in double digits in almost 1/3 of countries, and markedly above target in just a bit less than half, particularly where monetary policy is not anchored by exchange rate pegs. And the right-hand side chart is showing that split based on exchange rate regime. Looking further at exchange rates, we do see that foreign exchange pressures have largely abated since the end of 2023. This is also a reflection of narrower current account deficits. The median current account deficit is expected to narrow by 0.7 percentage points of GDP in 2024, in part due to the fiscal consolidation efforts and improvements in terms of trade. On the right-hand side, we see that exchange rate volatility has also declined. The recent exchange rate weaknesses we've seen in the region have mostly been on the strength of the US dollar internationally, meaning that the US dollar has appreciated against most countries, particularly the economies that are more susceptible to trade restrictions. Our second piece of good news is the funding side. The region's nearly 2-year hiatus from international debt markets ended, with Côte d'Ivoire borrowing $2.6 billion in Eurobonds in January 2024. Benin and Kenya quickly followed suit in February, raising $750 million and $1 billion respectively. In June, Senegal issued $750 million, and in July, Cameroon issued $550 million. More than $6 billion has been raised from international bond markets this year so far by Sub-Saharan African countries. Additionally, Ghana's Eurobond restructuring was successfully completed in early October 2024. Progress on the restructuring front for the region can be seen in that orange line, other issuers, on the left-hand side chart. However, borrowing costs for the region remain well above pre-COVID levels, with yields about 200 to 300 basis points higher than before the pandemic. And this is consistent with global trends, representing that higher for longer narrative that we hear about. Despite these positive developments, challenges remain. While policy adjustments have helped to reduce imbalances and strengthen the external position, as seen by sovereign spreads narrowing and more countries returning to Eurobond markets, financing conditions remain tight, with many countries unable to access or afford financing. On the left-hand side, we can see that large external principal and interest payments are due both this year and next. And to counter these, significant inflows to the region will be needed, as shown in the shaded areas, but these do not appear to be forthcoming. This environment of limited financing and high debt service is already having significant impacts on the resources available for development spending. On the right-hand side, we see external debt service rising. On the all-important growth front, growth in Sub-Saharan Africa, projected at 3.6% in 2024, is generally subdued and uneven, and there have been minor downward revisions since our April Rio. However, economic activity is projected to pick up modestly to 4.2% in 2025, and that's our third piece of good news from the Rio. A delayed but broad-based recovery is expected next year, driven by macroeconomic stabilisation, a more accommodative monetary policy on the back of lower inflation, and in some cases, less frequent power cuts. For instance, growth in South Africa in 2025 is expected to improve on the back of post-election sentiment and a reduction in power outages. Nonetheless, there are significant variations in growth rates across countries in the region. This divergence is particularly obvious between resource-intensive and non-resource-intensive countries, with resource-intensive countries growing at about half the rate. In particular, growth has been dampened in 2024 by conflict and insecurity, especially across the Sahel, the impact of drought on agriculture, for example, in Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, and the impact of drought on hydroelectric power generation, broader electricity shortages in the Central African Republic, Guinea, Madagascar, and Mali, and the ongoing macroeconomic tightening across the region. Bright spots, consistent top performers include Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, Rwanda, and Tanzania. Overall, regional growth does remain sluggish. Per capita income growth remains insufficient to significantly improve living standards or achieve convergence with global income levels. And there's a continued divergence between resource-intensive countries and the rest of the region. As I mentioned earlier, resource-intensive countries continue to grow at about half the rate of the rest of the region, with oil exporters struggling the most. One of the reasons is structural weaknesses in the business environment and governance, which continue to hamper their efforts to diversify following the 2014-2015 decline in commodity prices. Let's now turn to the risks. The outlook is clouded by uncertainty, with risks tilted to the downside. Some risks are domestic in nature, some are regional, and some are global. And just to give you a few relevant examples, number one, climate change. Long-lasting dry spells and catastrophic floods witnessed this year have worsened food insecurity, and these may continue. Epidemics. Over 1/3 of the region has reported at least one case of Mpox, with the highest share in the DRC. And the recent Marburg outbreak in Rwanda is another reminder of the risks there. Volatility in commodity prices. There's uncertainty surrounding commodity prices, for instance, because of conflicts, and this could lead to lower investment in the region. There's also the possibility of a slowdown in advanced economies, potentially due to further geoeconomic fragmentation. And of course, one other downside risk is volatility in financial markets. The risk premia for emerging market and developing economies could swiftly increase, again, also because of conflicts. We use a global general equilibrium model to quantify some of the impacts of these risks. In the scenario of a 150 basis point increase in Sub-Saharan Africa countries' risk premiums, sovereign risk premiums, I should clarify, growth in 2025 to 2026 would decrease by 0.7 percentage points in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the decline in growth would be accompanied by a sharp fall of 5.2% in private investment. Policy rates would need to increase by an average of 0.7 percentage points to limit capital outflows from the region. The report also presents other scenarios that I encourage you to look at if you're interested. For example, we model a 10% increase in global energy and food prices, and we also consider a 1 percentage point reduction in the growth rate for major trading partners, so China, the Euro area, the United Kingdom, and the United States. To the policy section, painful trade-offs while navigating the path ahead. As discussed earlier, most sub-Saharan African countries still need to reduce macroeconomic imbalances. And this involves very difficult trade-offs, and there are no easy choices available. The challenge for many countries is in finding the right balance between macroeconomic stability, which is essential. This means that policymakers must address debt vulnerabilities and ensure debt sustainability. But at the same time, they face elevated development needs and spending pressures for critical public services. And lastly, there is political resistance to tax increases and social frustration over the use of public resources. Any strategy will need to, firstly, prioritise key spending to foster more inclusive growth and boost credibility and transparency to help address adjustment fatigue and build public support. In this very difficult context, the region has recently witnessed several episodes of political fragility and social unrest. Recent examples include Ethiopia, Kenya, here in Nigeria, and Uganda. And Sub-Saharan Africa remains disproportionately affected by particularly virulent forms of political instability, such as conflicts and coups. And these have primarily affected the Sahel region, as well as the very severe human toll. Social unrest can have large, persistent macroeconomic effects, especially in countries with limited political space, policy space, and weak institutions. More than ever, country circumstances vary, and we need to be very mindful about not oversimplifying and generalizing the complex dynamics at play. Often deep-seated structural weaknesses, including poverty, a lack of inclusion, perceptions of corruption, and weak governance, can create an underlying environment of social frustration. And in this context, particularly in countries that have socially active and media-savvy democracies, even a small spark can trigger widespread protests. Times are tough, and people have been expressing their discontent over the increasing hardships. Food prices are particularly consequential. While inflation rates are trending down, domestic food price levels have increased substantially over recent years and have remained high across the region. Food insecurity rates are a serious concern. And policy adjustments aimed at bolstering macroeconomic stability, such as increases in taxes or reductions in subsidies to contain fiscal deficits, can exacerbate these short-term hardships, especially if they're poorly designed and implemented, for example, without accompanying social safety nets. And this can increase the likelihood of social backlash. Moreover, generally subdued growth and/or growth that is not inclusive remains insufficient to rapidly improve living standards, reduce poverty, or close income gaps with the rest of the world, and can help with these structural weaknesses. So what is the policy mix? Looking ahead, the region will continue to grapple with a very difficult environment marked by still elevated inflation, high borrowing costs, ongoing exchange rate pressures, and persistent fragility in some countries, all while policymakers are striving to boost income per capita and build public support. Our message: the policy mix needs to be carefully calibrated based on the size of the macroeconomic imbalances, also while taking into account political economy constraints that affect the feasibility of adjustment. Different circumstances require different approaches. We like to think of the policy mix in its entirety, calibrated to the level of the imbalances. About 1/2 of countries exhibit high macroeconomic imbalances in terms of their price stability, fiscal or external positions, or inflation, while less than 1/5 of countries show low imbalances. And fiscal positions often drive overall imbalances. For many countries with high imbalances, a front-loaded pace of adjustment may be inevitable, given the context of tight financing constraints. Front-loading could ensure the credibility of adjustment plans, but it may also exacerbate economic hardships and social tensions, thereby increasing the risk of undermining reform support. Protecting vulnerable groups is key, and international financial support will be particularly crucial for this group of countries. Countries with more moderate imbalances should expect to continue to pursue adjustment, or else be prepared to face the costs associated with high debt service. But the pace of adjustment could be more gradual relative to countries with the high imbalances, and that gradualism can help to reduce political and social tensions. The small set of countries with low imbalances can focus on rebuilding fiscal and external buffers. These economies utilised their policy space during the past number of years of crises, and now it's time to replenish their safety margins. On monetary policy, for many countries, the main decision at the moment is whether and when to start reducing policy rates, given that inflationary pressures are receding in many countries. But for other countries, the prospect of rate cuts remains elusive, given the persistence of inflation and its social consequences, including on poverty, and the desire to cement credibility and re-anchor expectations. On fiscal policy, the challenge for many countries is finding the right balance between addressing debt sustainability vulnerabilities and ensure debt sustainability, while facing elevated spending pressures for public services, as well as political resistance to tax increases. Debt pressures have been rising. In a few countries where debt is unsustainable, debt restructuring may be inevitable. Despite the significant economic and social burden of debt restructuring, the costs associated with it could be lower than inaction. All of these measures will require building social acceptability, a strategy to help mitigate social frustration and ease the task of policymakers. Will have to involve several key elements. It's a package, and no piecemeal approach will work. So some things to think about. First off, effective communication and consultation strategies will need to be part of the mix. This includes things such as clearly communicating the benefits of reform, the costs of inaction, and the compensatory measures that will be used during such reforms, while addressing misinformation. Collaborate with key stakeholders, for example, parliamentarians and community leaders, to gather insights and concerns, and provide regular updates on reform progress and establish feedback mechanisms to sustain support over time. Second, an appropriate design of reforms, including appropriate sequencing and appropriate compensatory measures, for example, social protection to protect the vulnerable. And this includes using fiscal policy to promote inclusion. These measures cannot be an afterthought. They must be part of the overall package. And finally, countries need a strong governance framework that fosters trust in government and its ability to effectively implement policies, including by promoting transparency, increasing accountability, and controlling corruption. Policymakers want perceptions like this chart here. Do governments use taxes for the well-being of citizens to move further in the good direction? To further complicate the very difficult task at hand, global development aid to the region has been on a long-term decline, steadily dropping over the past 3 decades. And perversely, this decline in aid comes at a critical time when financial pressures are mounting, stressing the need for continued official development assistance support. Amongst all of this, at the Fund, we remain steadfast in our commitment by helping the region navigate its challenges through offering policy advice, financial assistance, and capacity development. The IMF has significantly expanded its role in the region, stepping up lending support through a marked increase in upper credit tranche and rapid credit facility programs, alongside the new Resilience and Sustainability Facility, which is aimed at addressing climate change. This heightened engagement and increased workload reflects the growing demands and urgency as we play a critical role in stabilising economies and addressing pressing needs across the region. Currently, 26 out of 45 countries in the region have ongoing IMF financing arrangements, with over $5 billion disbursed so far in 2024. The IMF is also stepping up its capacity development efforts in the region, with a focus on fiscal and monetary areas, including debt management. Last year, Sub-Saharan Africa received 40% of IMF's direct capacity development, the most out of any region in the world. And this year, we anticipate an increase of about a quarter in capacity development spending. Capacity development to Sub-Saharan Africa includes training courses, technical assistance missions, and long-term experts. Fragile and conflict-affected countries remain a priority, both through our regional capacity development centres and the deployment of our in-country long-term experts. And climate-related capacity development is increasingly integrated into our offerings and is becoming a key growth area, not only for countries under the Resource and Sustainability Facility, but also all countries in the region. Let me conclude the conjunctural part to the main chapter before I move on to outlining the analytical notes. Our key takeaways for the main chapter are, firstly, 3 pieces of positive news. First, declining macroeconomic imbalances. For example, inflation is coming down, debt has stabilised, and external pressures are abating. Number 2, there's been a reopening of international markets with many Eurobond issuances. And number 3, there's an emerging, albeit tepid, economic recovery. But challenges remain, notably 3 to think about. Firstly, there's an ongoing funding squeeze, with many countries still unable to access or afford financing. There's subdued and uneven growth, particularly in resource-intensive countries where their growth rates are very low. And there's growing social frustration. We provide a suite of policy advice, including, firstly, policies should be thought of as a package and carefully calibrated to the size of the imbalances faced. Second, fiscal adjustment can and should be carried out without undermining development and inclusion. And thirdly, we make some suggestions on how to make those needed reforms more socially and politically acceptable. So I'll now just briefly outline our 3 analytical notes accompanying the main report. So these are always topical issues to the region and provide further analysis on specific structural challenges. Our first note is on job creation in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa faces an urgent need to create jobs for its growing population, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected countries, as well as low-income countries. And these countries account for nearly 80% of the region's annual job creation needs. By 2030, half of the increase in the global labour force will come from Sub-Saharan Africa, requiring the creation of up to 15 million jobs per year. The region's labour markets, though, suffer from high informality and significant barriers to job creation, leading to a shortage of quality employment opportunities. To address these challenges, there's a need for inclusive productivity growth, targeted worker-level policies, and the removal of obstacles to firm growth, alongside structural transformation towards higher productivity activities. The second analytical note is on growth divergence. 1 region, 2 paths. Over the past decade, growth in sub-Saharan African resource-intensive countries has been less than half of that in non-resource-intensive countries, and their income per capita has stagnated. Fuel exporters have fared particularly poorly. This divergence has largely been driven by the confluence of 2 factors. Resource-intensive countries, particularly fuel exporters, experienced a dramatic decline in their commodity prices in about 2014-2015. And critically, the impact of this shock was exacerbated by structural vulnerabilities, including weak governance, poor management of resource revenues, a poor business environment, limited human capital, and a high incidence of conflict and fragility. Reigniting durable growth will require a stable macroeconomic environment and the removal of policy distortions through things like stronger fiscal frameworks and broad-based structural reforms. These could include strengthening governance, enhancing the business environment, accumulating more human capital, and addressing infrastructure bottlenecks. And our third note is on gender equality, levelling the playing field. Most sub-Saharan African countries have made significant strides in reducing gender inequality over the past 2 decades. However, a range of obstacles, including restricted access to opportunities through legal rights, education, health and finance, continue to constrain women's and girls' potential. Empowering women and girls can create a powerful, inclusive growth engine for Sub-Saharan Africa. Closing gender gaps in female labour force participation alone could increase GDP by 10% and by up to 30% in the countries with the largest gaps. It's particularly important to increase women's access to productive, secure jobs. Our policy recommendations include removing the remaining legal constraints, making sure that girls stay in school, including by addressing harmful practices such as child marriage, and improving financial and digital access for women. Applying a gender lens to macroeconomic policy and structural reforms will significantly increase policy effectiveness. So, with that, I will conclude and pass back to our moderator. Thank you all very much.
Round of applause again for Athene Laws. Thank you so much for that report. A lot of work went into that report. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rhoda Sodiri. I host the Global Business Report on Arise News, and I'm looking forward to having a panel discussion on what we've seen so far. So, as a reminder, everyone uses these reports from the IMF, from governments that want to benchmark their performance against what is in the reports, to the private sector, if you're a fund manager that's looking for a way to invest, or even you, if you're looking to diversify your portfolio across a particular region, to media like myself, or academia like the Pan-Atlantic University, LBS for their curriculums, and so on and so forth. So we're going to get into a panel discussion right now. I'm going to call up the panelists on stage with me. After we're done with the panel, where we'll take some questions from you as well. So to kick things off, please give a warm round of applause for Catherine Patillo, Deputy Director, IMF African Development. And also, please give a warm round of applause to Mr. Bismarck Rawane, CEO, MD of Financial Derivatives Company Limited. And ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause to Mr. Dr. Franklin Ungu, who is the Director, LBS Public Sector Initiative, and the senior faculty. And also another warm round of applause to Dr. Olusegun Omisaki, who is the Chief Economist at the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. Welcome, sir. Last and certainly not least, please, a warm round of applause for Samuel Sule, CEO, Renaissance Capital Africa. Catherine, I'm going to start with you. We've seen the projections, 3.6% GDP growth for 2024, unchanged from 2023, 4.2% for 2025. I do want to ask you about the opportunities for growth going into that new year, because there are some headwinds. For instance, if you're an oil-producing country, there are projections that oil could fall in 2025 because OPEC Plus on 2 occasions, I think in August and also in October or November, declined to add more barrels of oil to the market because they've been trying to support prices. But non-OPEC Plus countries like Guyana, Brazil, and Canada and the United States are pumping more oil. So, the IMF report has dimensioned the number of countries in the region. For the oil-producing nations, and I guess for the wider region, what are the opportunities for growth for 2025? And I think I'll give you my microphone.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Fantastic to be here. We're launching our Rio in the region and picked Nigeria because we knew we would have a really, fascinating discussion, and I'm so happy to be on this panel with, these super smart and knowledgeable people. So I think we can have a really good discussion and hear from you. Before the question, I would just again stress the main message that Athene was outlining. That right now policymakers have this difficult balancing act then of trying to reduce macro imbalances while addressing development outcomes and making sure that these reforms in this difficult context are socially and politically acceptable. Now, there's a saying that everything tastes better with butter, and similarly, it's like that with growth, right? It's easier to do reforms. It's easier to do things when growth is strong. And as Athene outlined, right now, growth is not strong. It's subdued. It's not enough for reducing poverty, for improving living standards, for making up for the past couple of years, or for getting back to the very high growth rates that we did have pre-pandemic or pre-commodity price shock. Athene also outlined this big divergence then where the resource intensive, particularly the oil exporters, are growing at half the rate. And just to highlight again what that means, that means that people in those countries then are seeing, much less improvement in living standards in a resource-intensive country on average in the region. Poverty reduction effectively stopped around 2015, so that now a child born in a resource-intensive country is likely to live 4 years less and be 25% more likely to be in poverty than a child living in a non-resource intensive. So these growth differences have real impact, on people. Now, on your question, so what was hurting growth in 2023? Lots of different factors across countries, but we highlighted, these electricity and power issues, the climatic shocks, and conflict and security issues. So obviously, working on these areas, climate adaptation, and all that's needed to make countries more resilient, because these shocks are going to continue. They're not going to stop. And how do you make yourself more resilient? Reforms in energy sectors, as well as, of course, addressing these underlying security issues. But for bigger opportunities, I would point to, the need for this growth then to increase and lead to more, widespread productivity gains and jobs. It can't be growth that's very enclave-driven, just one part of the country. It has to be broad-based growth that creates jobs. And there are a number of mega trends that I think a lot of African countries could leverage that give a lot of potential for growth. And those would be, well-known acceleration of digital technologies. Second, the demographic transition and the incredible increase in workforce population in the region. And the third, the global shift toward the green transition. The region, has such potential in all of these areas. Thinking about, the green transition, so well endowed with renewables, 30% of the world's critical minerals. Thinking about demographic transition, again, this fact that Athene highlighted, you can just not stress enough. The rest of the world is aging. Workforces are declining. In Sub-Saharan Africa, workforces are increasing. Again, that stat that's just so, I think, striking. When you look at the global labor force, half of the entrants to the global labor force by 2030 are going to come from Sub-Saharan Africa. people like you here in Lagos Business School. This is, I think, just kind of mind-blowing. And again, a great challenge for growth, but an opportunity, as well as, digital infrastructure where there's so much dynamism and potential.
Thank you so much. Mr. Bishop Morani, let me come to you. I want to ask you about how sovereign states in the region can make some type of headway in improving living standards. And nobody says poverty eradication anymore. People now say poverty reduction. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how that is possible when you're looking at reforms, because reforms in the short term, they bite, and you've talked a lot about that. So can you speak to that?
Thank you. I think there are two elements to what we're talking about. One is how to increase productivity and growth and output. The other one is how to reduce poverty and inequality. So let's take the first step. What are the things that can be done immediately and long-term to improve output and productivity? I think clearly productivity is a function of skill and technology, and to a large extent in certain parts of Africa, power supply. So if you take Nigeria, for example, we're still hovering around 4,000 or 5,000 megawatts. That was power transmission from the grid 20 years ago. We're still at 5,000 now, while population has grown. So something dramatic has to happen about power supply. And I think that there should be some short-term solutions, very quick solutions that can address this, including the debt overhang of the power distribution companies, to the metering of the power supply so that you can get money into it. And every 1,000 megawatt increase in power supply can actually lead to a kind of corresponding increase in output. Having said that, how will this increased output and increased productivity be translated into income equality or inequality, reducing income inequality on one hand, and opportunity inequality on the other? Because that is what technically leads to conflict. You have this, what you call the cost of living crisis, manifests itself into end bad governance and so on. So I think one will address the power supply. We address the resource, like oil and mineral extraction process, to ensure that revenues increase and output also increases. So that addresses that. Now, as you address and reduce subsidies, which are reverse taxes, you want to see how are those funds deployed in such a way that it takes care of the more vulnerable parts of society, at the same time while compensating those who are investing and taking risks. Now, if you see, the ranking of countries based on their GDP, Nigeria has dropped from number 1 to, technically speaking, number 4. But also, the gap between the big economies and the smaller economies is beginning to shrink in nominal terms. And also, there's a very perverse relationship. You have seen that some of the countries that are growing faster are those who are carrying out reforms, one, and also, in some cases, post-conflict economies, because they have addressed some of the fundamental imbalances, political imbalances domestically. So when you put all of that together, you ask yourself that how are we going to address the immediate growth problems, and how do we address the allocation of resources in such a way, like a Marshall Plan, IDP things and all that, and also dealing with security, because it is clear that the higher the income inequality in certain countries, the Gini coefficient, the more vulnerable these countries are to crime and kidnapping, ransom, and all that. So, for using Nigeria as an example, it's important, one, reform must be accelerated. We must address the issues of governance at the same time. We must take some very, very drastic steps, unorthodox steps in dealing with power supply, telecommunication, digital technology, to make sure that security is covered. And also we must be able to redistribute income and opportunities so that you don't have this kind of wide variance where you have the income per capita in Maiduguri at about $800 and the income per capita in Abuja about $9,000. That's too wide. And that is what is leading to this resentment and potential for crisis where you have the Maghreb area, then you're squeezed by the Niger Delta restiveness. When you put those two together, it's a potent mix for failure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Mr. Irwani. Dr. Olusegun, let me come to you. On jobs, you've seen the stats. Catherine already repeated it. By 2030, the report says about half of new entrants into the labor market will be from Sub-Saharan Africa. What needs to be put in place to ensure that there are jobs available for these amount of youth that are coming into the labor force across the region?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think looking at growth and job happens to be one of the best ways to address development itself. For instance, I'm going to speak about the whole region, but of course I use Nigeria as a case study because more or less these countries exhibit more or less the same economic structure. Other speakers have taken enough time to talk about the relevance of jobs and how this can lead to higher productivity. But again, when you look at the case of Nigeria, or indeed the whole of the region, mostly this is the economic space is dominated by informal sector. And so that's a very big factor that we need to consider. Again, if you look at the case of Nigeria, agriculture and non-tradable services contribute about 80% of jobs. Thirdly, in the case of Nigeria also, most of the jobs that we have, or wages or employment, about 92% of them are in low wages. So this gives a more practical situation to the link between job and growth across Sub-Saharan Africa. At the Nigerian Economic Summit Group about 2 years ago, we did the analysis that looked into the employment elasticity of growth. In other words, how much do you need to grow to create how much job? And that's a valid point because most of the time we create a separate narrative of growth without looking at what will this lead to in terms of job creation. So about 2 decades ago, you have a situation in Nigeria where the higher you grow, the more poor people become because the growth type is not driven by where growth is needed. Job is needed. So I think we need to be very strategic about job creation in SSA. We need to be very strategic. Over time, job creation has been left alone as the afterthought of macroeconomic narrative. So when you stabilize the economy, jobs will find itself and then things will be normal. No, I think we need to reverse that and make sure that job creation strategy becomes the cornerstone of macroeconomic stability. And I'll give you an instance. If you look at most of the countries' development plans, again, Nigeria as a case study, which, of course, we've been part of this process. We lay more emphasis on macro space, and then we quickly rush down to sectoral planning. So we need to look more about sectoral planning. First, you identify what are the strategic sectors that are meant to drive the vision for the national development. So if the national development is pro-digital revolution or pro-services, what are the sectors that are meant to do that? And then the next question is then to say, what type of jobs would those sectors need to pull everything out? Lastly, you see the same case of Nigeria and indeed the region. You have about 60% of the sectors are what we can call stagnators, because they are stagnating growth potentials. These sectors are growing below 5%. You have just few sectors in the case of Nigeria, maybe oil and gas recently, high city growing in such a higher rate. But you then have other sectors that are going negatively. So if you merge everything together, where we can identify jobs are actually among sectors that are not growing. And so these are the critical parts of national planning that we need to look into by diving into the sectors and not just seeing them as the afterthought of macro, planning and designing.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Ungo, let me come to you. Best practices for improving competitiveness. And I have to say, shout out to the LBS. Great website. When I was looking up Dr. Ungo, pulled up his profile, there's a video where he was talking about a new book he's published on corporate governance. And you linked corporate governance to economic growth. So perhaps you can also touch on that in terms of how that can boost competitiveness for the region.
Thank you very much, and thank you, IMF, for this session. I think that before I answer the question, let me say that the report pointed out to some good things happening in Africa and also areas that we need to improve. And there are other reports that said that in 2024, about 10 of the 20 fastest growing economies will come from Africa. There's also another report that says that 17 African economies will achieve above 5% growth this year and going into next year. It means that there are some areas that Africa and some African countries are doing well. So the question is, what do we do now to improve competitiveness, to improve governance, as you rightly pointed out? So, of course, when you're doing planning, you ask yourself, where I am now, where do I want to go, and how do we get there? So we know where Africa is from this report. So the question is, where do we want to go, and then how do we get there? So I think that in terms of improving competitiveness, that there are certain areas that Africa should focus on. But there needs to be a framework that will guide that, will I say innovation, will I say that competition, as the case may be. So number one, so we shouldn't focus on areas that are being focused in Asia or maybe South America or Europe, because we have our own African peculiarities. So one area that we are supposed to focus on is on how do we improve electricity, power in Africa. Because, of course, with power, you can do a lot. So what are the sources of power that we can exploit based on our African peculiarities? Then the second one is on how do we feed Africa? That is food insecurity. How do we innovate, given what we have? How do we improve on what we have? And there are some African countries that are doing well in power, in agriculture. Then the third one is how do we industrialize Africa? Whether it is about selpas, whether it is about oranges, whether it is about bananas, let's focus on certain areas that we have comparative advantages. Then the fourth one is on how do we integrate Africa? Because recently I went to some African countries, and it was my first time of going to some African countries that the flight time is just 1 hour. So it means that Africans, we don't really interrelate or integrate. And of course, with our Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, it means that if we're able to integrate Africa more, it means that we can be able to achieve more competition, more growth, and all that. And then, lastly, is to improve the living standards. But I believe that if we look at these 5 or 4 key areas, and also South Africa, Botswana, and maybe Southern Africa, you've done reasonably in industrialization, or maybe Egypt, Morocco, and so please help us with innovation, with framework, with governance that will enable that industrialization. Then we now look at agriculture and say which countries are doing well in agriculture, and we learn from them as well. Then we now look at maybe industrialization. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to look at our areas of comparative advantages and the countries that are already doing well in those areas. They might not be at the level that we want, but we can now learn from them. That will help us to domesticate, to transfer, to adapt some of these policies that can now be used across different African countries.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Samuel, let me come to you. You're on the you lead the investment banking team at Renaissance Capital for Africa. Before that, you were head of debt capital markets at Standard Chartered. So I want to ask you about debts and the overhang. When the report talks about that and what that will entail for the countries that are weighed down by debt, does that present an opportunity in terms of restructuring on a team like yours, or is it indeed a hindrance that is going to hold the region back?
Thank you very much for that question and for your time here today. I think as Renaissance Capital Africa, recently we were the first Africa group to represent bondholders on a Eurobond restructuring, and we did that for Ghana. I think we're also very keyed in many of the African countries, do transactions, about 8 of them. So our point of view is we've seen certain peculiarities across the countries that make them debt unsustainable, or on the other side, debt sustainable. We think that fiscal consolidation is a very material part to that. Now, when you look through fiscal consolidation, on a base level is how much is the government earning and how much is the government spending. I think even as individuals, you know this. If you're spending more than you earn, you end up where many of our governments are. Using Nigeria as a case study, the question is, if government spending is moving much higher than where its revenues are coming from, that needs to be funded. And that is typically funded from debt sources. Those debt sources could be either domestic, as we're seeing in the domestic markets. And the sidebar to that is when your domestic markets become more conventional, they become very expensive in high inflation environments. I think the second part of that is around the external debt position. And even though that has grown and continues to grow and puts many governments under intense levels of pressure over time, especially when there's devaluation, that has been relatively balanced on the side of things. The question or the problem there is that it's very expensive, and even if you were to borrow at 10%, $1 million, when $1 million is 100, when $1 million then becomes 500, you're essentially paying 5 times plus the interest in question. That is where we see some of that debt unsustainability come through, but there are ways of dealing with it. We think that with resource-driven countries, the problem has always been you're rich or you've got money so you don't need to do any work, but money without direction, money without a focus or a structure always causes issues. As you've seen with the IMF presentation, many of the countries in which the IMF is in are the countries that are fiscally consolidated, and that's where you see the higher growth. So it's one of where you are more disciplined, and the more disciplined you are, perhaps the better your economy performs. And that's very clear. And I know there are certain conversations. Of course, Ghana is now in there, Ethiopia, and you're starting to see GDP growths in many of those countries increase. You're starting to see more sustainable debt levels. But again, domestic debt, interestingly restructured under the Ghana situation, is something that comes into context. There's an argument that countries can print their own currencies, and they should be able to. But at some point, your currency becomes unsustainable. And how do you deal in that instance? You can print it, but it leads to hyperinflation, a la Zimbabwe, a la almost happened in Ghana, but that was basically cut. So these are fundamental, call it, political or political economic questions that need to be solved. I think the other thing we'll typically point to is when you look at public debt over government revenues, as I've mentioned before. If you look at the countries with the largest numbers, so Egypt, luckily they have got very good friends in the Middle East who have decided to buy part of the country and also invest, is at 565%, 2023 numbers. Zambia, again, just gone through a restructuring, 594%. Ghana, 516%. Ethiopia, 471%. Nigeria, same as Ethiopia. It does raise where the concerns will be. And these numbers are very clear for all to see. So looking at the country's numbers, you can tell who's debt sustainable and who's debt unsustainable and who's basically moving forward. I think the final part is really around debt service costs, both domestic as well as international. That is really, again, if you're using all your money to service debt, what money do you use to develop? How do you develop infrastructure, has been mentioned? How do you develop education, which is one of the primary factors for becoming a developed country? How do you feed yourselves? And I think we all know what the answers are. We all know what the questions are. And we'll see how things evolve over time. But many of it, let's not be confused, is not economic. A lot of the answers are actually political, which is why elections matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Kathy, I'm going to come back to you on the question of the gender inequality. And the report points this out. I'm actually going to pose this question to you and Mr. Arwane. But for you first, the improvements that we've seen being made in the region, how can the sovereign states within the region build upon that?
Thank you. So the first is the good news that there have been a lot of improvements in gender equality over the years in the region. And you see that, right? The number of women dying in childbirth is lower. The number of girls pregnant before 19, lower. Girls and boys going to school at much more equal rates. Laws sometimes getting more equal in terms of the approach to women's ownership of property or inheritance of assets. So you are seeing some progress. But the real, hurdles to women being more active in labor markets, in economic participation, business, et cetera, those hurdles are still very much there. We talked about the informal sector. A large share of women are in the informal sector, much higher than men. The access still to financial services, to ability, again, to use assets is still constrained. And child marriage in a lot of countries is still relatively high. So that means, again, early pregnancy, risky pregnancy, girls dropping out of school. I'm so glad to be in Lagos Business School, and I always look out the gender balance here between, male and female students looks really good. And education, as of course we've been discussing, is the key. So what can governments continue to do? I would say first, let's eliminate these ways we're shooting ourselves in the foot with policy-induced distortions. So still working to make sure that laws push for more equality, and the existing laws for gender equality are enforced. And you do see progress in that. Rwanda had some progress in letting women access land titles. Uganda, protection of property. Namibia has a recent law prohibiting workplace discrimination. And all of these, I think, are starting to pay off in what you see women in the labor force and on the business side. So you can eliminate those kinds of distortions, as well as sometimes distortions in the tax systems. In some countries, the income of a married woman is considered the property of her husband for tax purposes, also really dissuading participation. So eliminate, those. And then instead, look at policies that can benefit everyone, while including, a gender lens in them to help, address these gender gaps. So, you could think of, again, progressive income taxation. It's good for everyone, but it really helps, again, with women. Or certain types of government expenditure, safe transport, water and sanitation, education, again, good for everyone, particularly helpful for women. Financial inclusion, having financial inclusion strategies that really say, where are these access gaps? And when you develop strategies, think about, financial literacy for women, tailored financial services for women to help then with, more access. So I think there is, again, a lot of progress, still, a lot of hurdles, and a lot that governments are doing, but more that they can do.
Thank you so much. And thanks for pointing out the gender diversity at the LBS. And for everyone on this stage, at Financial Derivatives Company Limited, at Renaissance Capital, at the NESG, in fact, full disclosure, I worked under Mr. Rewane, and he was very impactful in my career to where I am today. And I actually saw the gender diversity there. So, Mr. Rewane, can you also piggyback on that and speak to the economic benefits of gender diversity for the region?
Okay, thank you. I'll take three particular examples. First, sometime last year during the elections, or before the elections, they had this currency redesign program. And all of a sudden, everything came to a halt. And the emergence and the relevance of POS terminals for making payments. When we looked at all of that, the ATMs were not generating any cash. We saw that the bulk of the POS terminals all over the country in the marketplaces were run by women. And so you had this kind of segregated economy where you had the high-end people using bank transfers, and at the bottom of the pyramid, everybody was using cash. And that also, even though cash was only about 3% of total liquidity in the system, we saw that when cash got stranded, economic activity actually ground to a halt. Two was that at the same time, sometime in May this year, I attended 3 different graduation ceremonies in the U.S. of my relatives. One was at USC, the other one at Columbia, and the other one at Harvard. And as I went through the list of people graduating globally, I noticed more women than men. Secondly, then when it came to the Africans and the Nigerians, it became even more glaring that there's emphasis on women relative to men in terms of persistence ratio. That pointed to something. And then I listened to Caldwell, the guy who wrote The Tipping Point, and the Revenge of Tipping Point after 25 years. And he did say, and allude to the fact that initially this DEI thing, and that first and foremost was to keep the Jews out of the Ivy League schools, then keep the Asians out of the Ivy League school, and that the next thing would be to keep the Africans out of the Ivy League. So he's alluding to the fact that this is happening. But generally speaking, we see a lot of emphasis on female activity. Now, if you look at the Nigerian economy as an example, and it's happening across Africa, you'll see there's a shift from the real sector to the service sector. In Nigeria, in particular, trading, wholesale and retail trading, is contributing, maybe about 16% of GDP. And if you drill down into seeing what's happening in the wholesale and retail trade, at the bottom of the pyramid, it is dominated by female entrepreneurs. Now, also, another point is that the economist says that about 39% of entrepreneurs, Nigerians in particular, and in Zambia as well, are nascent, active entrepreneurs. And that is what drives the economy. So, one, the shift from the real sector to the service sector. Two, the intensity of trading. And three, the dominance of these activities by female gender tells you something that even though it might be strategic and deliberate, but some of it is happening consistently. So when you look at the report and you talk about next year and the year after, there'll be growth and these things are going to happen. And you anecdotally now look at the composition of the economy, both in the service sector, the trading sector, and even in the corporate sector, you'll find that many of these things are probably attributable to this shift from a purely male-dominated economy to a balanced economy where the females are contributing their own part to this whole episode. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rani. Dr. Usengo, let me come to you. And do remember that we will be taking your questions as well once we're concluded with our panelists. Mr. Rwani used an example to kick off his answer. He was talking about the cash policy and what it led to. I want to ask you about communication and the importance of being able to communicate reforms to the public so that they can anticipate and so on and so forth, as far as the region is concerned, because it was mentioned in the report. So what's your take on effective communication?
Yeah, so let me start with this analogy. The first scenario, if your product is bad, you will sweat to communicate. But you will still succeed when you get the feedback, when you communicate that your product is bad. So we are not using it. That's one. Secondly, you can have good products. And the product might not still be acceptable in the market because you don't communicate the value of your product. So you have today products that are less standard or that may not have real impact on people that almost everybody is going after because of the strength of the communication. And the third part is that you can have a good product and then you have good communication, then you dominate markets. Now, let's come back to policy in the policy environment. Communication is not an afterthought. It's not something that comes after the policy. And I think that's what, especially in this region, what the government and the ministers and the special advisors and should learn about reform communications. Policy process, indeed, is an act of communication, right? Policy initiation, ideation and everything depends on communication from the beginning, stakeholders. So you don't come up with something and throw it at people and then you start to let them know, just like the case he mentioned as per the currency change. And so where I think the government needs to lay emphasis now on is believe, first of all, that your product, whether it's good or bad, might not be received in the market. And it's natural. And you will see why some good policies are initiated and suddenly they are reversed. Because governments rely on what people say too quickly, and then they come back and say, oh, we're not doing it again, we're just trying to, and then they come again and people say, oh, this is good, and then they keep doing it. So I think for me, policy is what you start before the production of your policy. Communication is what you start before you produce your policy, and communication is what you do when you are done with that policy and whether you reverse back to it again. So it's such an interesting process that I think we need to start appreciating, especially in this type of the environment where people listen to what you say much more than the actual impact of what you are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ungu, you talked about earlier on, what needs to be done in order to boost competitiveness. So assuming communication is done, the reforms are put forward, how do you maintain that level for your government? You've put your reforms forward, things are doing well. How do you maintain things and keep that? It's almost like a road, right? I'm not sure which is what's more frustrating, a road that's never fixed or a road that you fix and is never maintained. So how do you keep the maintenance there?
I think, let me answer also from where he started. During the NESG summit, somebody asked a question and said that he has been attending the summit for the past 20-something years, I think 28 years. And that the questions and the issues raised in the first summit are still being raised in this last summit in 2024. So I will answer by saying that the first thing we have to do again and rethink is the governance system that we have in Africa. That will enable the sustenance of policies or reforms as the case may be. So the issues that we are having require for us to really ask, given our peculiarities or what we can call social embeddedness of Africa, that affects the formal environment, which now affects the governance, which of course leads to resource allocation, which is the key issue. So the question is, if the forms of governance we have in Africa can help us to sustain reforms? And the answer is no. Because if you have 4 years, before you know it, another person comes in, has a different agenda. Of course, he will start implementing his own. So I think that Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa, needs to sit back and say, the form of governance that we are using in different parts of Africa, are they suitable for our own peculiarities? And then maybe rethink or innovate a form of governance that will enable us to formulate reform, implement the reform, sustain the reform, so that even if there is a change of the president or governor, as the case may be, that the reforms will be sustained. During the NESG summit as well, the World Bank made a presentation and said that we need to do X, Y, Z. And as some countries have done it before, and some people were now eager to hear about a country that did it before. And he said that it was Nigeria, that we did it in 2007 for about 4 years. But the question is that after 2011, we came back to where we are today. So it means that the form of governance that we are using in Africa and in Nigeria might not be suitable. I'm not saying that democracy is not good, but it might be for us to rethink, to say, do we need an Africanized democracy, or democracy that is suitable for African peculiarities? Because if we keep going 4 years, somebody comes in, all the policies are removed, another one comes in, another policies are removed. You know, we keep going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So I think it's something that we need to sit back and say, what form of governance will work for Africa and will deliver Africa? So that we don't come back in 30 years or 20 years, and IMF will still present the same report, and we'll still have the same panel discussion, and the thing continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And then, of course, with every panel, we're always reminded about our electricity issues, right? Every time we have these discussions. Samosun, let me round off with you. I asked you about debt earlier. I want to ask you about the U.S. dollar. I was listening to, I think, an FX strategist from Rabobank who was talking about forecasting a stronger U.S. dollar in 2025 on the back of anticipated policies from President-elect Trump. What does that mean for the region, in your view?
Thank you for that. I think the one point we shouldn't get amiss is it's about stability, and the most stable African countries are those that grow. Stability equals or not equals to democracy, but stability is what matters, and I think that's what capital looks for. And in terms of a stronger dollar, I think almost all the equations lead to a stronger dollar. Tax costs equals budget deficit equals higher Fed funds rate equals higher dollar. Tariffs, 50% on China, 10% rest of the world, equals higher dollar US inflation equals higher dollar. Less immigration means higher wages, means higher inflation equals higher dollar. Higher GDP growth for the US as they look inwards equals higher inflation equals higher Fed funds equals higher dollar. The higher dollar is not positive for frontier markets, talk less of Africa. Africa is within that frontier market universe. There are ways of hedging it by selling more commodities as required, but we do know that each commodity is different, and the U.S. policy will have a very strong impact on Africa. Whether it's oil prices, where we expect that there will be more drilling because the current or the incoming administration is very pro-oil and perhaps less so on climate. And so we expect that U.S. will drill more internally. We expect to see higher drilling in South America. We think some of the policies across Central and Eastern Europe will free up some oil resources that have been under constraint for the last 2 years. That is not necessarily positive for the oil producers. Now, what they need to do now is increase production, so at least that's what's within control. I think we've also seen some positive policies, like with the Lobito corridor, all the way from Zambia, DRC into Congo, and that's mostly funded by USDFC. They're trying to get all the battery minerals, all the tech minerals that are required for an advanced society, and they're putting their money where their mouth is by supporting that railway line that basically gets it to Angola, from Angola straight to the US. So it's really how you play that. But there is a higher US dollar coming, perhaps end of 25, start of 26. That is not positive for frontier markets. It means that a lot of investors will look inwards. Apart from African investors that live in Africa would always look at Africa and invest in Africa. And that is one key premise that we are positioning for. Thank you.
A round of applause for our panel. Thank you all so much. Now we're going to take, I guess, one or two questions from the audience. I see some hands raised up. Yeah, a lot of hands. So just let us know your name, where you represent the company, and then who you want to direct the question to.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Henry Onokuba. I'm a faculty at Lagos Business School. Well, mine is kind of a comment, and it's a worry I've been having for a lot of years. I'm following from what my colleague, Dr. Franklin, said. In 1986, I could remember, there was this great debate whether to take the IMF loan or not. I think there was $2.8 million then. IMF gave us every good reason to take the loan. The then president, head of state, made it a public debate, and at the end of the day, we took the loan. The loan was supposed to make us better. And every year we have policies, recommendations from IMF. 8 years down the line, I am not sure Nigeria is better off today than when we started romancing with the IMF. Is it that the IMF policies are not tailored to the peculiarities of Africa, and Nigeria in particular, or is it that the execution has been poor? So should we continue to trust the IMF? Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure who wants to take that, but just quick comment, yeah? Quick comment. I'm not sure why the IMF continues to be put forward as the entity responsible for bad decisions that have been made for certain economies, and then somehow, I don't know. But please, I do want someone to. Mr. Rwanda, please go ahead.
First and foremost, Nigeria didn't take any loan in 1987, the IMF. Secondly, there was a debate, and it was about a set of policies. It was basically a structural adjustment program called SAP, and which would be followed normally by a facility and a loan. The structural adjustment reform program was not inimical to Nigeria, or neither is it inimical to any country for that matter. So you can't have selective amnesia and say you take this and you don't take that. The policy environment, the institutional strength within the country, and the leadership, right, and the governance all come together. If you don't have a comprehensive package, then you will not get the desired outcome. And between 1987 and now, I think there have been quite a few interventions of the IMF here, including during the COVID time and all of that. And people are clapping and all of that, but that's totally inaccurate. If you are allergic to the IMF, then you must be allergic to even the COVID monies and all of those things that come along with it. So there are a series of programs, policy support instrument programs and all of that, balance of payment support program. So to use one brush to say this institution is responsible for your failure is to actually miss the point. The truth is that, yes, there are challenges. Yes, you can get institutional support from multilateral agencies, including the ADB and all of that. But the onus is on you to actually do your work and stop blaming others for your failure. Thank you.
You want to? Okay.
Yeah. No. Great discussion, and yeah, I think you guys have made the good points. But just to note, the IMF is always evolving and trying to improve, right? When would you have thought many years ago that IMF would have been coming to talk about, jobs, about women's economic empowerment, about the importance of communication and consultation. So we're always trying to learn and see how to do things better. And indeed, some ways that we did support countries in programs at earlier periods, which had much more emphasis on, when countries did fiscal adjustment, cutting spending, and you see maybe those had some negative impacts. Then we look and say, okay, countries need to support their own development, so maybe you can help with more, domestic revenue mobilization. So we are, I think, always learning and evolving to the new challenges, and has been said, then, working with governments who need to be in the driver's seat then for their own policies and for the stability that's the prerequisite then for growth and development.
Thank you. All right. Well, we do want questions, right, as opposed to comments. So we're going to take about 3 of them in a row, and then I'll take notes of the questions. So do go ahead, sir.
Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Wonderful conversations going on here. My name is Chuma Nwankwo. I work as Regional HR Manager for Africa for Mediterranean Shipping Company. I have 2 quick questions, actually. The first is, when I hear that resource-intensive countries might not be doing as well as the resource non-intensive countries, I find it difficult to wrap my head around that. I thought that the fact that you have commodities should set the foundation that you need to prepare you to greater economic growth. I refuse to accept the notion that oil is a curse and not a blessing. So I would like one of the panel members to help me understand this correctly. Second, quickly, is that we've spoken a lot about either communication or some of the soft issues that are important for reforms. I think it came out strongly in the key takeaways from the IMF report. The last one there says, make reforms socially acceptable. And I agree fully with that. The problem then is that you need trust for you to make reforms go through, in my view. And if you don't fix that particular issue, it will be difficult. I believe that good leaders can ask you to do anything, no matter how difficult. They can even ask the whole country to do something, and then they can get it done. And I see that as one of the challenges in Africa. And we need to dimension exactly what we mean by trust to fix the issue of trust deficit in getting reforms through. Without that, we can't go anywhere with reforms. And when I dimension that, I quickly look at 3 things: competence, character, and the communication that has come out. So how do we fix this? Do we build a model that would help countries and policymakers to understand the predictability or the likelihood of success of any reform, looking at those dimensions? Or do we look at how to mobilize the entire populace so that they can support reforms by starting from the beginning to look at the competence of those who are coming to lead them, the character of those who are coming to lead them, or the way they communicate to get their messages across? Because this is the issue. It's not ethnicity. It's not religion or all those issues that we quickly and simply rush to as the problems of Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much. Next.
Sorry.
Okay, can we get it? We do want some ladies to answer the question. So we have some ladies in the front here. So can we get a microphone to, I guess... Yes. Okay, well, the lady down here, please. Yeah, so you're right. Yeah, you're right.
Thank you very much. My name is Fumi Ogunlesi, and I cover government affairs for Sub-Saharan Africa for Citibank. Sam is a colleague of mine. We've been in the trenches several times. My question is on the external environment, and it sort of segues from some of the comments that were made, particularly by Sam, in terms of the incoming Trump administration. With this somber outlook, SSA, or Africa actually, is heading into a very volatile external environment. And it's not just the incoming Trump administration, but also wars, civil war in Sudan, volatility on the Horn, the Sahel, and so on. And my question is, and anybody can answer, what's the view, what are our policy, what's our room to maneuver as African policy makers, given the very volatile external environment? What's the impact of a Trump administration going to be? Is it benign ignoring of Africa, or neglect, or, take a hike, or, what's the likely outlook, and what then become the policy rooms to maneuver for African policymakers? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
All right. My name is Antonia Okocha, representing the average Nigerian youth. You did speak about the need for strategic job creation to drive macroeconomic growth. What sectors should an oil-producing country like Nigeria, what sector should we leverage on to drive global economy? Then, looking at the education system in Nigeria, do you think that the financial literacy that is required for the average woman to grow is being justified with what we have now, and what can be done? Then you mentioned that we shouldn't also leverage on just one resource, which is the oil, that we should look into green energy and digital energy. Is that not going to also be to the detriment of countries like ours that our economy is oil-driven majorly? Thank you.
All right, I think a couple more questions so we can get... okay, so we do have... we're going to take one more question because our panelists have to run. Just one more. We're going to take one more because we have a number of them already.
So, good day, everyone. My name is John Paul. I'm a student of Pan Atlantic University, and my question is directed towards Dr. Franklin Ugu. So, he did make mention of one of the solutions, or probable solutions rather, to the many problems in Sub-Saharan Africa rather. So, you mentioned about the integration of Africa. I don't want to make assumptions on what you meant by that. So, I will start with asking you, what exactly do you mean by the integration of Africa? Do you mean easier transportation from one African country to the next, like it is in Europe? And what role do entrepreneurs play in the integration of Africa? How exactly does entrepreneurship affect the integration of Africa?
Thank you. Dr. We'll start with you on that question.
Thank you very much. I think what you more or less, if I'm marking your paper, I think I will give you distinction for answering it the way you've answered it. But it includes both infrastructure and other aspects of integration. But let me explain better. Like, if you travel to some African countries, it will surprise you that you'll be queuing for your passport and visa to be checked. But some people who are not Africans will be going through an express lane. It means that Africans have been constrained or restrained from moving around Africa as compared to non-Africans. That's one aspect of integration. Another aspect of integration is that many of us here don't speak French. And it means that once you are in Cotonou or in Togo or in Abidjan, you will not be able to communicate or do anything. Interestingly, these are countries that are very, very close to Nigeria. And it means that if we're able to communicate in French, or if they're able to understand English that we speak, it means that there will be more integration, more interaction, more trade, more growth, more inclusive engagement, and also education as well. If we're able to have a kind of curriculum that speaks to African peculiarities, better curriculum that speaks to African peculiarities, from primary school, secondary school to university, it will also help. But what you see in Nigeria, you said, this is British curriculum, not African curriculum, or this is American curriculum. But as long as we are not intentionally integrating Africa in all aspects of integration, it means that we have a challenge. It's happening small. Because if you go to some African countries, you hear Nigerian music. But we also want to see that there are Nigerians, there are Cameroonians, there are Gabonese across all Africa, and they are free to move, they are free to interact, and trade is also enabled as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Catherine, did you want to take the question on financial literacy for women, or is there any question you wanted to answer in particular?
Yeah, maybe I would go on the questions about resource-intensive countries and growth and the green energy transition. So the question, is this an oil curse? I think no, there are resource-intensive countries in other parts of the world that have still managed to have decent growth, but you saw such a big shock, the commodity price shock, 2014-15, big reduction in income. And then in a lot of the oil countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, you just weren't able to recover from that because even as prices did go back up, some countries weren't able to take advantage of those higher prices to increase production because of issues like security issues in the oil regions or maintenance. So there wasn't enough investment then, or you had countries still not managing fiscally their oil revenues, so that in fact oil revenues, instead of saving any oil revenues by year, most oil exporters in Sub-Saharan Africa spend everything in the current year. And so you're not able to ride out the cycles. Business environment, corruption, etc. So it's not inevitable, but what has happened post 2015 has led to that difference, and those problems also show what needs to be done with, again, better fiscal management, addressing the business environment, and addressing the security environment, so that you can take advantage of your natural resources. Then on the question on is the green transition going to not be good for countries? I think there's just so much potential. The cost of renewables are going down globally, solar and wind. There's still big setup costs, but then operation is much lower. So you need the finance in order to be able to develop those. And clearly we've been discussing the power sector and energy. There are 600 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa without any access to electricity. Clearly you can't have growth and development without that. People can't operate businesses, people can't function. So you need that, and it's going to be different in different countries. Independent power producer agreements to increase, mini grids or on-grid solutions using renewables or other sources to increase electricity.
Thank you. Dr. Olusegun, is there any question you wanted to address? As we round off? Okay.
So I think the first question I was trying to address is around oil countries being poor. It's one of stability, and it's very clear. Most resource countries typically are not as stable as non-resource countries. Very simple, because there's a very strong correlation between being in power and being able to extract some of those resources for perhaps personal gains. That's the first part. I think the second part to it is the population of those countries are typically higher. I'm not sure what oil does to people, but it seems to do something, and it does it very well. And if you look at Africa and the countries with the largest GDP per capita, you start with the Seychelles, you then move on to Mauritius, Gabon, Botswana, I guess Libya to some degree, but that's because it's got a lot of oil and close proximity to Europe. Equatorial Guinea, again, very, very small population. South Africa. But the top 5 are not oil producers. And that level of stability that is gotten is perhaps one of the reasons why they're a bit more focused and a bit more able to focus on non-resource components of their economy. And in terms of Trump, the Trump administration incoming, I think the logo of the campaign, the ethos, is an inward-looking one. We're going to make one place great again, and the question is, how do you ensure that place is great again so you can extract some level of value? And I think that's perhaps the only way to look at it, because even Europe's going to have a very tough time next year, and I think that's very clear. And if Europe is having a tough time, I'm not sure where we come as a joint continent. The final part is really around job creation and whether it's going to be led by oil. No, the answer is no, very clearly. In 2003, it was 64,000 oil workers in Nigeria, for example. Even if you were to say 20 years later, it's double that. That's not enough for a population of 220 million people. So it's certainly going to be non-oil, and perhaps it's not going to be paid employment. There will be a lot of entrepreneurs that have to then build these businesses. So looking for paid employment, if I was a student today, is perhaps not what I would look at. I might look for paid employment plus, but that plus is certainly more important than the other.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our panel. I want to take a photograph, of course. Let's bring up our VC. And Anne, let's go come up as well. Let's take pictures. And a round of applause, please. This is a fantastic panel. Very insightful. Okay, so our photographer is right there. Thank you all so much. Can we give a round of applause to Dr. Christian Egbeke, country representative for the IMF. Fantastic guy. Thank you all so much. Round of applause. Thank you all. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And now it's time for networking. So if you want to mingle, have some business cards, chat with any of the panelists. They're all busy, so I know that they're all running. If I can catch them right before they go. You've been great. Thank you all so much. It's been a great afternoon. And do download the IMF reports. And it's very, very informative. Thank you all so much. Well done.
Don't mind my comments because I wanted to.